Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Nurturing Resilience and Motivation in Children with ADHD, the Search for Islands of Competence. In a sea of neurotypical peers, a child with ADHD may feel defined by their challenges. Low self-esteem may follow and lead to negative coping strategies. This is when it's particularly useful and beneficial to identify that child's islands of competence, the natural strengths upon which they can build resilience, confidence, and lifetime learning habits. In today's webinar, parents, educators, and professionals will learn how to identify and reinforce a child's islands of competence and the components of a resilient mindset. We will discuss ways to fulfill the role of charismatic adult to become a source of strength for children and teens with ADHD. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Robert Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital in the Boston area. He has lectured nationally and internationally and written extensively about such themes as resilience across the lifespan, education, children and adults with special needs, psychotherapy, parent and family relationships, and creating positive school and work environments. He is the author and co-author of 19 books, including Raising Resilient Children, The Power of Resilience, Achieving Balance, Confidence, and Personal Strength in Your Life, and Tenacity in Children, Nurturing the 7 Instincts for Lifetime Success. Dr. Brooks has received many awards for his work, including Hall of Fame awards from both the Connecticut Association for Children with LD and CHAD. Most recently, he was given the Mental Health Humanitarian Award from William James College in Massachusetts for his contributions as an educator, clinician, and author. He has also served as a consultant for Sesame Street Parents magazine. Additional information about Dr. Brooks may be found on his website at drrobertbrooks.com. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Brooks, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may submit your questions for our expert at any time by navigating to the text box under the video player. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in an email that you'll receive about an hour after we wrap up the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast 408 to access the slides, webinar replay, and Certificate of Attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. If you do so now, you will receive our forthcoming fall issue and its special Success at School section with strategies for students, educators, and caregivers. Finally, the sponsor of today's webinar is Play Attention. Improve executive function and self-regulation. For more than 25 years, Play Attention has been helping children and adults thrive and succeed. Tufts University School of Medicine found Play Attention significantly improved attention, executive function, academic performance, and behavioral control of students with ADHD. Your program will include a lifetime membership and a personal executive function coach to customize your plan along the way. Home and professional programs are available. Call 828-676-2240. Click the link on your screen to schedule your free one-on-one consultation. Visit payattention.com to learn more. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars, but sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Brooks. Thank you, Dr. Brooks, so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Annie. And I want to thank Carly Broadway. It was a pleasure to work with her in planning this webinar. And I'm going to get right into it since I'm going to be sharing like a 40-plus year career in about 35 minutes or so. As I say that, I'm glad you listed my website, because on my website for the last 20 years, I've been writing a monthly article. And I just want to let viewers know that many of the ideas I'm going to be speaking about today, they're briefer articles on my website. So without further ado, let me give a brief definition of resilience. And one of the things I learned is different people have different definitions, especially now in co-editing the third edition of the Handbook of Resilience in Children. One could see that there are these different definitions. So without wishing to oversimplify things in any way, I'm going to use this brief definition today. It's the capacity to cope effectively with adversity. It's not that resilient children or adults are not going to face adversity. It's not that they're not, they're going to still feel stress at times. But one of the key, really, for me, attributes of resilient children and adults is when problems come up, they view these problems as challenges to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. As you'll hear in today's webinar, we really have to help our children to become much better problem solvers and believe in themselves. Think of it this way. I've often, in live performances, if you will, asked an audience, who in this audience has ever faced a problem where your first thought was, I don't even know where to start? And I'm the first one to raise my hand. And everyone at some point in their life has had that feeling, where do I even start to handle this problem? And then I say, imagine this. Imagine if almost every problem you faced, you felt that way. That's what leads to anxiety, to depression, to feelings of helplessness. And so we want people to start to feel there are these problems there, but there are things we can do. And for children, it's learning how to turn to adults to help them to learn to problem solve. I just want to share a little about the background of my interest in the concept of resilience, especially when working with children and adults with ADHD. I've been in the field for almost 45 years now. When I first started, certainly in our schools and even in our mental health facilities, we did not know as much about ADHD. And I found that I was not doing as effective a job as I could with working with some of these children and adults with ADHD. Also, one of the most challenging positions I ever held was at McLean Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital. And my first position there was as principal of the school in this child and adolescent program in a psychiatric hospital. And at that point, we were really not even diagnosing kids with ADHD. And many of them, their behaviors was seen as things that they could handle if they wanted to. And in many respects, we were not doing a very good job. And when you start feeling as a therapist that kids are getting worse in your care, or as a school principal, kids are getting worse rather than better, you have to do a lot of soul searching. So one of the things I love to do is the following. I would say some of my first publications were on storytelling. Some people have said storytelling is one of the most effective forms of learning about people in therapy. And so I started to collect stories of kids with ADHD and some from adults who looked back at their life and what it felt like. And these stories revealed, not surprisingly, was that their mindset, how they saw themselves, were burdened with negative feelings and thoughts that worked against the development of resilience. And I actually made a list of what are some of the main characteristics of kids with ADHD in terms of how they saw themselves and others. And this is a quick summary. Their stories reveal themes of helplessness, that there was nothing they could do to get better, hopelessness, that there was really no future for them, feeling misunderstood. That came up a lot. And not surprisingly, a lot of them would say to me, teachers or my parents say, try harder. And I'm trying so hard. A lack of fairness. Why did this have to happen to me? Why do I have to have ADHD? And one of the interesting ones in several of the stories I got was that they felt they made little positive, I'll say, difference in the world. One girl I was seeing in therapy, she was about 12 with ADHD. She said to me in this story, the only difference I have made in the world is I think people are more unhappy since I was born. And when you start reading these things, one of the things I started to ask myself as a school principal and as a therapist, how do you help people develop a sense of hope? How do you help people who feel helpless to not feel that way? How do you help kids feel they're being understood? What do you do when people feel there's a lack of fairness and making little difference in the world? One of the stories I got was from a 7-year-old girl with learning and attentional problems. And she wrote a story, as many kids do. She wrote a story about herself, but it was in the form of a dog. And in that story, this dog, this puppy, who had trouble learning and paying attention, just as she did, because it was about her, said she was worried. This dog was worried that when she grew up and had puppies of her own, they would wonder why their mother was not very smart. And this made this dog feel very unhappy. So in her story, she's saying the puppy already was worried about that when she grew up and had puppies of her own, they would think she was not very smart. And these stories were just extremely powerful for me to get insight into the lives of children with ADHD. And again, every kid is different. Every adult is different. But these feelings came up time and time again, these themes. And so it really led me to think about, as I mentioned, how do you develop hope in kids? How do you develop resilience? And so that was the beginning of my journey. And let's look where it took me. I started asking this question: what is the basic foundation for overcoming a negative mindset and nurturing resilience in children with ADHD? What are the essentials? I asked this as a parent, as a therapist, as a school principal, and I was more and more getting involved with working with schools in terms of helping kids with special needs. So what was one of the things I found was a basic foundation in terms of research that was taking place. And let me explain this. I say the presence of what the late psychologist Julius Siegel called a charismatic adult, an adult from whom children gather strength. So just to give you a little background in this, when psychologists became increasingly interested in the theme of resilience, they started asking this question, some of the initial research: why is it that some children could grow up under very difficult situations and yet as adults be much more hopeful and optimistic than you would have ever imagined? So they studied adults who had grown up in war zones, adults who unfortunately grew up in abusive homes. I've always been interested, as you could tell from what I've been talking about, in really kids who grow up feeling like failures in school, kids who feel that they may never learn, like that girl who wrote the story about a dog who really wondered what her own children would think of her when she had children someday. And so they asked these adults who had difficult childhoods, they said, we could have never predicted, based on how you were growing up, that you would be as hopeful and as optimistic as you are today. And these adults, decent jobs, good relationships, and they asked this question: what do you think was one of the most important things in your childhood or adolescence to help you to be resilient today? In just about every study that was ever done, bar none, the first answer was always the same. And in some ways it sounded very simple, but in a very spiritual way, it's why we're all here. They all would mention at least one adult along the way who truly believed in them and stood by them. And one of my heroes in the field of psychology and resilience research was a psychologist, Julius Siegel, who died about 20 years ago now. He had a practice in Washington, D.C. And in the 1980s, he wrote a brief article where he said, in research conducted around the world about children of misfortune, those are any kids who grow up under great adversity, one of the things that really helps them to be resilient is the presence in their lives of what he called a charismatic adult. Sometimes I almost wish he had not used the word charismatic because it seems to have different meanings to different people. But his definition is nothing short of poetic. He says a charismatic adult is an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And let me just add this. I'm often asked, do we as adults need charismatic adults in our lives? And the answer is, unless we've decided to be a hermit, we certainly do. We all need these charismatic adults in our lives. So as I began to discuss the importance of charismatic adults, not surprisingly, I added this slide. I was going to say, not surprisingly, I got a question, but I wanted to add this slide that it was a wonderful report out of the Center of the Developing Child at Harvard. And it just confirmed what Dr. Siegel found. The single most common factor for children who develop resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. Actually, Dr. Siegel, in one of his articles, said in a surprising number of cases, maybe he shouldn't have been surprised, the charismatic adult in a child's life turns out to be a teacher. So it could be almost anyone, but hopefully it's someone who has regular contact with a child. Now to get to the question I've often been asked. As I've talked about charismatic adults, not surprisingly, I've heard this from parents and teachers and other caregivers. You know, Bob, I want to be a charismatic adult for children. What do I say and do to assume that role? I remember one of my presentations, I think this woman was kidding. I'm pretty sure said, Bob, what do they look like? And I say, I think they look pretty much like you and me. But it's an important question because imagine right now, I stopped and said, thank you very much for inviting me here to do this webinar. Everyone listening would right away say, but what are some of the things we can say and do so that we could be a charismatic adult for our children, for our students, for therapists listening, for kids we see in therapy? So let's look at, in one sense, the mindset of charismatic adults and what they say and do. And so I've selected several key ones. There are more in articles I've written, as I mentioned, on my website, but I've selected ones that really audiences have told me they were able to think about, reflect upon, and use right after even the workshop. So let's start. I call it the mindset and strategies of a charismatic adult. The first one is, as charismatic adults, for ourselves and for the kids we work with, to adopt an outlook of personal control. As I define personal control, many of you listening will say, Bob, that sounds a lot like the Serenity Prayer. It certainly does. And there's certainly great overlap. But if you go to my website, there's really many articles on personal control, even more since the pandemic hit. Personal control is this. To me, this makes just a lot of sense. You don't need research, but there's research to support this. Resilient people, when difficult situations arise, they focus more and more of their time and energy about things over which they have some influence. People who are not resilient often try to change things over which they have very little control. Let me give you one example. A psychologist, Paul Gerber, did research, especially with adults who had learning problems growing up. And he looked at adults with learning problems who are doing relatively well in life now and those who are not. And one of the key dimensions he found, which distinguished them, is adults who are resilient, doing well, years before gave up the thought, the mindset, why did I have to be born with a learning problem? I've worked with some adults, 55, 60 years old, who still bemoan the fact that they were born with a learning problem. But resilient adults basically say, I was born with a learning problem. I was born with ADHD. I had no control over that. What I have control over is my attitude and response. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to adopt that attitude and response to different events and situations, but it's something we have to work on. Paul Gerber's research showed these resilient adults with learning problems started focusing much more on what they had control over, their attitude and response. Those who were not resilient kept really regretting that they had to be born this way. What happens after a while is then you develop a victim's mentality, as we talk about in psychology. So one of the things, just to give you an example, there was a boy I was seeing in therapy, a 9-year-old boy with ADHD. One of the first things he asked is, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? Now, if he continued to have that question, it would keep him from looking at what he could do. And in therapy, what I tried to help him with is the following. Kids are born with ADHD, different reasons. You know, I didn't get into with the 8 or 9-year-old, he was 9 at the time we discussed this. I didn't get into all the brain research, whatever. But I said to him, now that we know you have ADHD, there are things adults can do to help you, and there are things you can do, because you want kids to feel a sense of ownership, of personal control. So this is very powerful to look at what we have control over and to remember what we have control over is our attitude and response to different events and situations. And a book where I really learned this is a book written by a psychiatrist, a Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl. Some of you may know the book. I've read it 7, 8 times now, called Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about in a concentration camp that he said there were, and it was, again, very significant. He said, even in a concentration camp, there were a few brave men and women who would give away their last morsel of food to someone who was even more hungry than they were. They proved the Nazis could take anything away from you but the last of the human freedoms, to choose your attitude and response in any given set of circumstances. Frankl is talking about being in hell in a concentration camp, but he says even there, we may have more control over our attitude and response to things than we realize. I don't want to be overly dramatic about that, but when I read Frankl, this goes back, I first read that book in graduate school. I started looking more and more as a therapist, and it was a beginning therapist then, obviously. How do I help people to develop this sense of personal control? Another key dimension of being that charismatic adult is to appreciate the importance of empathy and understanding and responding to our children and teens, to attempt to see the world through their eyes. And some of you know the work of Daniel Goleman, the psychologist who wrote Emotional Intelligence book and another book, Social Intelligence. He says one of the key dimensions of a relationship, any relationship, is empathy, being able to see the world through the eyes of another. So as I started to bring empathy into my work in terms of trying to understand it and help my patients understand it, as I brought it in much more into my webinars now, of course, and before that, my presentations, people ask, are there certain questions to help us be more empathic? I got this a lot from teachers and parents. We think we're empathic, but are there certain questions, especially when we work with some kids with ADHD? And so over the years, I've thought about the questions that I've gotten feedback are some of the ones that most help people who are working with kids or raising kids to be empathic. So think about how you might answer these. What words do I hope my children, or you could fill in my students, or in any situation, my colleagues, what words do I hope my children use to describe me? Every child has words to describe us, whether they're our students, our own children. So this I found could be very helpful. When I'm actually meeting with parents, I say to them, think of 2 or 3 words you hope your children use to describe you. Then this question, what do I intentionally say and do on a regular basis so they're likely to describe me in the way I would like them to describe me? And you have to be more intentional. Like when I've worked, I'm thinking of a recent webinar with teachers where they said, we hope kids would describe us, our students, as caring. But I get very specific. What are things you actually do to help kids to feel you're caring or loved or, whatever the words may be? So what do I intentionally say and do on a regular basis so they're likely to describe me the way I would like them to describe me? And what words would they actually use to describe me? And I'm smiling. I smile easily anyway, but every time I give this example, I cannot help but think of a number of years ago. I was meeting with about 200 parents in a live presentation, obviously, or I should say in person. And at this point, all of a sudden, this woman said, "Oh my God." She just blurted it out. I thought there was a medical emergency. And then she apologized, said, "I'm sorry, Bob, those questions are really very good." Well, any speaker wants to hear his or her questions are good. So I said, "Thank you." And then it was just like me and her with 198 people or so listening in. She said, the first word I hope my kids use to describe me is calm. I said, calm. And she had this smile on her face. So I pursued it, the question. I said, "Do you think that would be the first word they would use?" And it was almost funny. I would say it was funny. She said, "Not at all, Bob. I've been yelling at them for 12 years. I don't think calm is the first word they would use." And she came up to me afterwards and she said, "Those are very good questions. In one sense, I know my kids have words to describe me, but I never stopped to think about it." And this really is very helpful to me. And there are many more stories I could tell you about these, but they will have to wait for another time since I want to make sure I get in, through this webinar, all the points I want to make. Oh, so let me just give you a little background. One of my patients with ADHD, he was referred to me when he was in about the 8th grade, because things had really been going downhill. When I asked him about his teachers, he said to me the following. He said, "I had a teacher in the 4th grade, Dr. Brooks, who really did a number on me." And I said, "Really?" He used to say to me all the time, "You're lazy, you're unmotivated, you'll never amount to anything in life. You better get your rear end in gear." And his most words were, "Try harder, just do better. What's the matter with you?" And even now, a few years later, when this kid described this teacher to me, you could see how upset he was. Well, this particular patient is a wonderful artist. He's won art contests. And at that time, I was writing a book about school climate. And I actually asked him, and his parents' permission, if he would draw some pictures for my book describing his experience in the 4th grade. And I show this to help us realize something we know if we stop to think about it. Like that mother said, that every one of our kids has images of us and words to describe us. So the first thing I asked him is, "Would you please draw a picture of how you think your teacher saw you every day in the 4th grade?" And I don't know if you could see it clearly. It's sick in the brain. He said to me, every time I thought this teacher looked at me and he kept saying, "Try harder," and "What's the matter with you?" I thought he was saying, "You're sick in the brain." And he's an adult now and a successful adult. And he said to me, when you're really feeling very vulnerable and you feel an important adult in your life is really criticizing and judging you, you really wonder, maybe there is something really wrong with my brain. I then asked him to draw his teacher. This may be very tough to see, but the teacher's basically, the kid on the right is basically saying, "Thank God it's him and not me being yelled at." The teacher's giving a thumbs down on this test. And on the left is a statement that says, "Work sets you free." I was stunned. Some of you may know that "Work sets you free" was the slogan on the entrance to every concentration camp. And I said to this patient, I said, your teacher had a Nazi slogan in the room? And I love this patient. He said, "Not at all. But you told me I could do what I want. That's my editorial comment. I would have felt like being in that room." And that, by the way, that's how the picture actually appeared in the book, and then this one. So think about this. When you say try harder, you could do better or whatever, how would we feel if we were struggling with something and someone said, "If you just tried harder, you could do better"? Empathy really involves also that golden rule. Don't say or do anything to someone else that you would not want said or done to you. Let's continue. So we have personal control. We have the importance of empathy, trying to see the world through the eyes of a child. And I'm going to get a little into motivation now. To believe that all children from birth want to learn and be successful. Why do I bring this up? Because I cannot tell you how many adults along the way, parents and teachers and others, would say to me, this kid is unmotivated and really doesn't want to do well. Psychologist Robert White in the 1950s, a psychologist at Harvard University, said from birth, inborn, one of the most powerful drives is the drive for effectiveness, to master your environment. He said, you see it, every kid, they're so curious, they want to do things. And then I started to talk about White's work and say, let's start with this assumption. Children from birth want to learn and be successful throughout their lives. But one of the questions I then got is, well, wait a second, Bob. You were principal of a school in a psychiatric hospital. Was every kid motivated there to do their work? No. And so if such a drive exists, why do so many children and adolescents seem unmotivated? It's a very important question. But one of the things I've learned is the following. I believe all youngsters are motivated, and other people have discussed this, but unfortunately, some are dominated by avoidance motivation. There are some psychologists who said, every kid is motivated. You'd be dead if you weren't motivated. But for some kids, the strongest motivation is avoidance motivation. So now it presents a very interesting question. If every child is born to master his or her environment, this drive for effectiveness, why is it that some children seem unmotivated? You see, they're motivated, but what research is showing, for some kids, especially kids with ADHD and learning problems, one of the strongest motivations is avoidance motivation. Why do you avoid attempting a task? And I've just selected a couple of things. It's a way of protecting ourselves from situations that these kids believe will lead to failure and humiliation or emotional and physical exhaustion. I actually have worked with kids who would rather be discipline problems in school and be sent to the principal's office than have to be in a classroom where they feel like a dummy. That's the extent to which they go. So if we accept the notion, we want to be charismatic adults, this child desperately wants to succeed, but they're not, people say they're not trying, they're using avoidance motivation. Where does this lead us? Thus, rather than asserting that children or teens are lazy, unmotivated, or resistant, we should ask, how do we lessen avoidance motivation in children and students who use it? Or what changes should we implement in the strategies we use to lessen so-called resistance or avoidance motivation? None of us should be blamed. We should not blame kids if they're using avoidance motivation. We should not blame anyone. Instead, we should ask this. Are there things I could do differently in the classroom? Are there things I could do differently at home so that my son or daughter, my student, will be less likely to use avoidance motivation? We get away from blaming kids, just like my patient. He always felt blamed rather than that teacher saying, how do I help this kid who has many talents? You could see his artwork, rather than saying to him that you're just lazy and unmotivated. I know I'm probably speaking to the converted or choir here, but these are very important questions about lessening avoidance motivation. All kids are motivated. Some have to resort to avoidance motivation to really lessen the stress and anxiety they're feeling. And I will say this, every one of you listening to this, we've probably all used avoidance motivation. Have you ever gotten a call and you look at caller ID and say, I don't want to speak to that person? Avoidance motivation. Anyway, I could give many more examples, but let's continue. So if we are to lessen avoidance motivation, if we're to be the charismatic adult, we then have to look at the characteristics of a resilient mindset and the behaviors associated with this. And all of them I'm going to talk about also has to do with intrinsic motivation. Just a little background about a resilient mindset. When more and more I felt one of our main goals as parents, caregivers, teachers, is to develop a resilient mindset in our kids. What I meant by that is, and this was a very exciting part of my career, I started to list the attributes or characteristics or outlook of resilient kids. And I put these together, and with my colleague Sam Goldstein, we wrote several books about this, into the concept of a resilient mindset, assumptions and expectations we have for ourselves and others that guide our behavior. So what I'm going to go over now are what helps kids to be resilient, even those who have struggled mightily and have felt hopeless and helpless. So I'll look at some of these, because each one of these, if we can address, will help to nurture resilience and develop a resilient mindset. And as I say, the behaviors associated with this mindset in our kids. One, resilient kids are comfortable with and appreciate that others can be of support and assistance and provide a welcoming, non-judgmental environment. I've especially worked with many, many teachers about what helps kids to feel welcome. One research study I did, it was very informal. I interviewed many kids between the ages of 4, 5, and 18 and asked them what a teacher or school administrator could do every day at school to help them to feel welcome. The two most common answers, greet me by name. And you know what the other was? And I'm doing it right now. I could tell, a smile. The smiles are very powerful. I was seeing one boy in middle school with a diagnosis of ADHD, very disorganized kid. And he asked me, before I went up to the school, he said, would you tell one of your funniest stories at the school meeting with my teachers? And I said, why? I said, because 5 of the 6 teachers I have will laugh. I have one teacher, she will not even smile. I was surprised. I said, she won't even smile? Why? Just like this, only out of the mouth of a child, a young adolescent with ADHD. She can't smile, Dr. Brooks. I said, she can't smile. Why? And this was one of the most interesting answers I ever got in my career, asking questions in therapy. I think she has paralysis of the mouth. And by the way, when I went up to the school, I thought she had paralysis of the mouth. So one of the things is, how do we help kids feel comfortable? So they told me, greet me by name and a smile. But do you know, and there's an article on my website, I wish I had more time to go over this. There's actually a whole body of research called Positive Greetings at the Door. It looks at what teachers could do from the moment the child enters each morning. Positive greetings at the door, which help to develop a greater sense of really belonging in the classroom. And it's things like greet the kid by name, ask them how they've been, these little things. And you know what this research shows? Kids' learning improves, discipline problems drop, and it's just this brief greeting. Greet me by name, ask how I'm doing, smile. And I don't want to overly simplify this, but we all know as adults, we feel the same way. Think about a time you went into an environment, you didn't know anyone, and someone greeted you and smiled and helped you to feel welcome. Think about an environment you entered where you didn't feel that way. So we have to think about, in any environment, what helps a kid to feel welcome. Another key issue, and this really goes a lot with personal control, is that from an early age, we have to recognize that a main task of parenting is to help kids learn to solve problems and make decisions. It can start with simple choices. Do you want to wear this today or this today? And they should be very simple. Do you want to start your homework before dinner or after dinner? In terms of when I was principal of the school in that psychiatric hospital, I learned that one of the ways kids develop self-discipline was not by me telling them what the rules of the school were. Within reason, we would actually ask kids, what rules do you think we need here so that everyone will learn best? I was so impressed that kids 5, 6, 7 years old, and we had adolescents also, could tell me things that they felt would be helpful. And the other thing is, especially if you have a child or a student with ADHD, they may forget a rule. So another thing I brought in is, I started saying to parents and teachers, say to a child, even as an adult, I may forget a rule. So if I forget a rule, here's how I would like you to remind me. And just select some way, write a note to me, just tell me. Then once you have the courage to say that to the kids, you can say, and how would you like me to remind you just in case you forget a rule? If a child with ADHD can tell you how they would like to be reminded, they're much less likely to see you as nagging them. I still remember one boy with ADHD who would, quotes, forget to take his medication in the morning and didn't want his parents to remind him. When I saw the family in therapy, his way of being reminded is he said to his parents, hold up a sign. And he said, I'm going to create the sign because I'll write please on it. And then the problem lessened a great deal, because at a certain time, if he had not taken his medication, they held up the sign that he had created. So you want them, this is what promotes personal control. What you get some of their ideas, how they would like to be reminded. And this is what also develops self-discipline. Another key dimension is this, and I just have a few more, and because I'm looking at the time here, to define and reinforce, this was part of the title, one's strengths or islands of competence. I believe a big mistake I made as a beginning therapist was I felt that when parents came in to see me about their child who's having difficulty, or I was consulting to schools about students who were having difficulty, I thought it was my role to hear what the problems were and then to offer strategies. So I could spend 2 hours with parents and basically talk about their kids' problems. I could go up to school and hear about a kid's problems. And at one point, I finally said, I'm feeling depressed after these meetings. I wonder how the parents or teachers are feeling. And it was at that point, this goes back almost 40 years now, that I had this image that many of my patients seem to be drowning in an ocean of inadequacy. And I said, if there's an ocean of inadequacy, there must be islands of competence. And I said to myself, I wonder what would happen after just 15 minutes with parents or with teachers to say, now that I've heard about a few of the problems, can you please tell me what you see? And I use words like this, your child's strengths, their beauty, their islands of competence. The whole tenor of the meeting started to change. And there's now research. And if you go to my website, there are articles about positive emotions. There's now research to show that if you create positive emotions, which I think the question about islands of competence was doing, that it actually, one of the things it does, did I just lose something here? I don't know what happened here. I'm sorry. No. Okay, I'll quickly. Okay, I got back to islands of competence. I didn't even touch the computer here. There's actually research to show that when you create positive emotions, people are better problem solvers, more willing to look at different options. I want to give you one example. I was at a school for kids with special needs. A lot had learning and attentional problems. I came back 2 years later. I didn't know they were going to do this. I had spoken to teachers in the afternoon, parents in the evening. When I came back 2 years later to do the same, I walked into the lobby, and I don't know how clearly you could see this. Throughout the lobby, every kid had drawn a picture of his or her island of competence. It's hard to see. And I'm standing actually with a quote that they quoted from one of my books, how important it was. And the teachers and parents said to me, Bob, you know what it feels like to go into a school and you see your students and or if it was parents, your child's, what they see as their strengths, just so positive. And the teachers at this school also tied it to using it to help change kids' mindsets. And it's very tough to see, but there's out here, I should say, is the ocean of inadequacy, and here are the islands of competence. So to help kids to change their view of themselves. And one middle school teacher said she started the school year, and this was just public school, started the school year by, instead of doing any work, having kids write down what they saw as their islands of competence. And she said, I spent the first really class time, the first period or two, just having kids talk about what their interests were, what their passions were. She said it brought the class together. And she just said it's been really discipline problems have dropped because kids felt you were looking at their strengths. And one school principal at a school for kids with special needs, it's almost impossible to see, but before they discussed a kid in that school, he had the teachers fill out a form. What do you see as this child's islands of competence? And how are we using these islands of competence to help the kid learn and feel more dignified in school? So what happened is then when you fill out this form, before you start talking about problems, he found it changed the whole tenor of the meetings in a more positive way. So we have dawns of competence. Let's look at the next thing. To believe that mistakes are experiences from which to learn rather than feel defeated. And I have just 2 more slides. This is another one. Another mistake I felt I made as a beginning therapist is I did not prepare people for the fact that some of my wonderful strategies might not work. And what I decided to do was, when these strategies didn't work, some kids felt even more defeated. Some parents and teachers felt more defeated. So I started to build in the following. I started to say, this strategy sounds very good, but in case it's not as effective as we would like, let's think of a backup strategy. So what I was preparing them for was, sometimes setbacks will occur, but we have these backup plans. And I really like that. And then I read a book by Gabrielle Udingen, who one of my articles on my website is about. And she wrote this book, Rethinking Positive Thinking, where I love her model. Whenever you develop strategies or a plan, also have the child or adult think about what are some obstacles to reaching this. And she puts it in terms of obstacles. And then if the obstacles come up, what are we going to do then? So this really helps with personal control. I mentioned before, you prepare for possible setbacks. And then if they come up, you now feel you have other strategies to handle them. You don't want to have a strategy where if it doesn't work, everyone gets more upset. The mindset has to be, if this doesn't work, we learn from it. And I know I'm going over all of these rather quickly in this relatively brief time, but as you can see, these all guide kids to be really much more resilient. And the last slide is the one to believe that one can contribute to and make a positive difference in the world. I learned when I was doing research for a book and asking people about some of their favorite positive and negative memories of school. I found that one of the most positive memories of school, and people between the ages of 21 into their 70s filled out this questionnaire. And there's several questions. I'm only going to go over the one. What was something an adult said or did when you were going to school that boosted your self-esteem, your motivation, your dignity? One of the main responses I got was when you were asked to help out in some way. I got things like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straws. I remember when a teacher asked me really to tutor a younger child. And I am a strong believer when I go up to schools, and the same is true in homes, but I'm sticking with schools right now. One of the first questions I always ask is, what is one thing this child or adolescent does at school that helps him or her to feel they're making a positive difference? This is what adds a sense of purpose. And I might add, it's not just kids. There is now research to show throughout our lifespan, elderly people who are actively involved in helping others, even an hour a week, lead longer lives and feel more resilient. And so I think there's so many things we could do at schools. There's research to show that when kids ready to drop out of high school are asked to go down to the elementary school and read to a child an hour or two a week, they are less likely to drop out. Every child in the school should have an opportunity to feel they make a positive difference. This is what helps them to feel welcome. And at home, we should become charitable families where we help kids or find ways for kids to contribute, not by saying, remember to do your chores, but by saying, I need your help, to have kids help others. This also is what develops compassion and caring. So I've gone over a lot of things very quickly. You have the slides. As I said at the beginning of my talk, there are many articles on each of these themes. And I just feel when I started to develop the list of a resilient mindset, that it was really helpful to me in terms of as a therapist and as a parent, and then helpful to me in working with parents and educators and caregivers to help develop really and nurture resilience in kids with ADHD. So that is it for now. We have about at least 10 minutes for questions, and I'm more than happy to take some questions. So thank you again for those who are listening. I hope this has prompted some thoughts about how we help kids to be resilient.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks. We do have quite a few questions. And I wanted to start with, something that really hit home with me, given our work here at Attitude, and that is those comments about being lazy. We recently asked our subscribers to our women's newsletter. So these are all adults. What comments really stick with you from your over your entire life? And I think half of these women said it was being told that they were lazy, that they weren't trying hard enough, and that they weren't living up to their potential. So I just wanted to stress that point that the laziness is that there is no such thing as lazy, right? And that those comments make a huge dent in people's self-esteem that lasts a lifetime.
I'm sorry for interrupting.
No,
I'm so
not at all.
excited by what you said, because when I've interviewed adults, both male and female, they often say words that really hurt them, where you're lazy, you're unmotivated, like that patient I described, and you don't try hard enough. And just for the listeners, because I had to go over so much, but I start with the assumption, like Robert White, every kid wants to learn and be successful. And I love to tell kids, I think you're really trying, but it's the way you're attempting to learn or the way the adults are teaching you that are not working. See, if you say strategies are not working, it's not just mental or accusatory. Anytime I've worked with a kid or an adult saying we need new strategies, they'll say, what are strategies, or what do I do? If you say to them, you're lazy and unmotivated, you've lost them. And as that patient said, he said sick in the brain, he said, when you think adults are seeing you as sick in the brain and you're lazy, you start feeling maybe you are. So I just want to reinforce what you brought up.
And we had a great question along this line. Someone wrote in to ask, can you suggest any responses that parents might give to family members or educators or others who are saying these things about their child? Yeah.
One is you have to be careful. You want these, I've learned this the hard way, you want these other people to be empathic towards your child. So you have to be empathic towards them. So if they should say that, I've been writing a lot, and my last 3 website articles is how do you prepare people to hear a message that they might not really want to hear? And so what I've said is, one way to look at things is, and some people do that, kids are lazy or not trying, but this is what I've said, can I suggest another way that may be more helpful? And that's when I'll say, let's start with the assumption that kids are trying, but they really right now may lack certain skills to be as effective as they would like. So let's really start with that assumption and think about what are the skills we can teach them? And so depending on the relation, I've sometimes said, if anyone said to me, I always use myself, if I'm having trouble, you're just lazy and not trying, I wouldn't want to listen to that person again. But if they said, Bob, I could see you're having some difficulty, let me show you different strategies to use, I'm much more willing. So it's important not to totally say to another person, that's mean or whatever, or opinionated, but to say some people have actually seen it that way. But I want to share with you another way of seeing it that I think will help the child even more. And there are many more responses. I've written a great deal about what I call empathic communication. And as I say, my last 3 website articles, I was only going to be one article, but I got so much feedback about it, all have to do with, when I got feedback about the first, I wrote 2 follow-up. How do you prepare people to hear a message that is different from their own? And with try harder, that's why even with kids I worked with, I think you're trying hard. And I truly do. They may be trying hard to avoid the situation, but they're trying hard to be able to at least feel that I understand what they're going through. Because one of the things I said in the beginning is some of these kids feel no one understands them, especially when we say you're not trying hard. So a little long-winded, but it's a very important question about preparing people to hear a message that will help to change people's, say, mindset.
Yes. And along those lines, several people are writing in that they're familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, as a strategy for adults to help them change a lifelong negative mindset. Can that also be helpful for children who are stuck in a negative self-view?
Oh, it definitely can. And again, I'm not necessarily the expert in all the forms. There are different forms of even cognitive behavior therapy. But one of the things is I think cognitive behavior therapy provides certain strategies where kids then feel more of a sense of what I mentioned before, personal control. There are things I could say or do. What I'm as interested in is how do you create environments where kids feel more comfortable? That's why I bring things up. Look at the kids' strengths, not just what their difficulties are. Do we provide kids with opportunities to help others? See, these are realistic, I think, actions we could help kids really take where it starts to change their mindset. When kids feel they're helping others, what does it say? It almost says to them, maybe I am worthwhile. Maybe there are things I can contribute to this world. So CBT is helpful. It's not just one therapeutic technique. Over the years, I've become more and more interested, not just in an individual child, but how do you start changing environments? But also, I learned a lot from working with many individual kids. And that's why I talk a great deal about reinforcing and finding every kid's island of competence and having them help out and viewing them as really attempting to succeed even when it looks like they're not.
And I will mention that you wrote a great article that's coming out in Attitude's next issue, the fall issue, about this very topic of identifying an island of competence and then building responsibility around it. And the story you told was of a child who was struggling in school, third or fourth grade, who was an animal lover. And
yes.
You were able to make them the school-wide designated classroom animal.
It was pet monitor. Yeah, pet monitor. I'm laughing because that was one of the first times I tried looking more positively. And thank heavens it worked out beautifully where this kid who you really used avoidance motivation became the pet monitor expert in the school. And he even wrote a little book and about how to be a pet monitor with his teacher suggested it. And his avoidance motivation just decreased markedly because now he felt comfortable in school. He was the pet monitor. He lectured in every classroom in the building before the end of the year. So I know I filled in probably the rest of the story, but thank you for bringing it up. It was a pleasure to write that article for your magazine.
Well, it really hit home. It was such a positive way to focus on that island of competence. And as a result, as you said in the article, everything else improved. Behavior, yes. Academics. It was, really a breakthrough. And it leads to another question we've received, which have you found any good ways to work in the islands of competence model and strategies into a child's IEP or 504 plan?
Oh, what a wonderful question. What I've tried to do, here I go smiling again, is I've advocated that the first thing on a child's IEP should be, and one doesn't have to use islands of competence, but that school principal, it wasn't an IEP, that form I showed. What are the child's islands of competence? Think about what that school principal did. It could have been part of an IEP. What are the child's islands of competence? Name as many as you can, it said, and then how are we using these in the school? And so like that pet monitor, I've had kids tutor younger kids I had one boy who was disorganized, but really wanted to help others. And his island of competence was he could barely straighten out his own book bag, but he was asked to go down like 10 minutes before the school day ended to help first graders fix their bags. That helped him to do his own. So there are so many ways it should be built in. When I go to a meeting, about a child, it may not be just in the formal IEP, but I make sure somewhere there's much more focus on strengths. And if I had my druthers, it would just be like that school principal, have a form. It could be attached to the IEP or it could be right at the top. What are the child's islands or adolescent's islands of competence? And how are we using it? Actually using it in the school to help the child feel more motivated. And I love the word, I use it a lot, dignified. So I would say she either should be part of the IEP or appended to the IEP.
I think that's just a wonderful way to end this conversation, which has been so not only insightful, we have a lot of people writing in to say that they've just had aha moments here in the last hour, but also empowering, because we're really leaving with some very practical solutions for caregivers and for educators. So Dr. Brooks, thank you so much. This has really been just a joy to be a part of.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And, quickly before we wrap up, I do want to thank once again our sponsor, Play Attention. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast 408 to access the slides, webinar replay, and certificate of attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. If you do so now, you will receive our forthcoming fall issue and its special Success at School section with strategies for students, educators, and caregivers. Dr. Brooks, thank you again for this really extraordinary presentation. We hope to have you back soon.
Thank you so much.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.